This is the 10th in a series of programs I'm doing on wisdom and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, and religion have said about it. My last program dealt with the issue of desires and how our desires can be a source of both happiness and unhappiness. There is a consensus among the great thinkers that if we are to live more fulfilling lives, we must deal satisfactorily with our desires. Socrates, I think, provides a good introduction. He said this: "What a dreadful, savage, lawless brood of desires is in everyone, even in some of us who are considered to be decent people." And Seneca, the famous Stoic philosopher of antiquity, put it this way: "So people go on tossing about and never find rest from their desires." Let me provide a brief review of the last program, and then this program will focus primarily on sexual desires and what the famous thinkers have said might be a wise attitude towards those desires. Again, a brief review first. What are some common desires? Well, to be on easy street, free of stress, frustrations, disappointments. Pleasure. Freud believed that we human beings are pleasure seekers. We seek out food, sex, vacations. Many people have the desire for love. Most people probably have the desire for love, and many of us, in fact, desire romantic love. And of course, huge numbers of people desire social approval. Montaigne, the famous French intellectual, provides some illumination. He pointed out that satisfying our desires is almost always mixed with pain. Some examples: when we try to satisfy our desire for food, we often eat too much, and this leads to a fear of weight gain, and also, even if we have no such fear, eating too much can result in discomfort and fatigue from eating too much. Our desires for sex can involve sexual promiscuity, at least for some people, and that can be accompanied by a fear of unwanted pregnancy, and as significant, a fear of disease. When people try to satisfy their desires for status and money, that can lead to tunnel vision, where one might work a job one doesn't like or work long hours because one is so interested in status and money. This could endanger one's health. And also, in certain circumstances, if one is very interested in status and money, if one has a great desire for these, one might compromise one's morals and therefore do some harm to one's soul. The wise person recognizes that desires can cause suffering, and also recognizes that our desires are insatiable. We can never get enough pleasure. Socrates pointed out that we can be in bondage to pleasure. Some people are food addicts, others are sex addicts, money addicts, smoking addicts, gambling addicts, drug addicts. Aristotle said this: "We may desire what is not good for us, and we may not desire what is good for us." Epicurus, the famous Epicurean philosopher, made this comment, and so many of the great philosophers are in one way or another in basic agreement with this. Epicurus remarked, "Tranquility is a blessing, and one achieves it by reducing one's desires." Again, tranquility is a blessing, and one achieves it by reducing one's desires. The major religions are in basic agreement with Epicurus. They also promote the idea that we should pay a lot of attention to our desires, since they can cause us much discomfort, and that it's important that we focus on reducing our desires. The Buddhists put it this way: the Buddhist heaven, which is called nirvana, is not a place like the Christian heaven, but rather it's a psychological state in which one is released from desire and fear. Again, the Buddhist heaven, nirvana, a psychological state in which one is released from desire and fear. The Hindus also promote a similar belief. The Bhagavad Gita, as I pointed out in previous programs, is a very famous Hindu holy book. And the Bhagavad Gita says this about desires. He knows peace who has forgotten desire. He lives without craving, free from ego, free from pride. And the Old Testament, in the book of Proverbs, says something quite similar. Pride goes before ruin, arrogance before failure. And the Chinese book of wisdom, the Tao Te Ching, also says something very similar to what the Buddhists, the Hindus, and some Christians and some Jews talk about when they talk about desire. The Tao Te Ching says this: there is no crime greater than having too many desires. There is no disaster greater than not being content. Lao Tzu is generally considered to be the founder of Taoism, and Lao Tzu is known for this comment among many others: to be content is to be rich. The ancient Greeks also weighed in on this subject of desires. The Greeks claimed that we don't need to conquer our desires, but rather learn to manage them better. The ancient Greeks emphasized moderation. The idea is that excessive desire for food, sex, status, and money causes us anxiety, whereas moderation in desire results in more tranquility. The ancient Greeks believed in the middle path between hedonism and asceticism. Again, the ancient Greeks, for the most part, encouraged people to follow the middle path somewhere between hedonism and asceticism. Montaigne commented that excess, not tranquility, is the enemy of pleasure. Again, excess, not temperance, is the enemy of pleasure. Is there a lesson for us in what so many of the great philosophers and religions have taught us about desires? Well, I think the lesson is this: we might experiment with reducing our desires and managing those that remain better. And we can engage in some reality testing. When we make this effort to reduce our desires, does it result in greater tranquility, as Epicurus and Plato and Socrates and the Hindus and Buddhists claim it will? A good example of desire run amok concerns a very famous Asian sultan who had a harem of many women. And he was so overwhelmed with his lust, his desire for one particular woman, that he had to have her killed to quench his desire. There are, of course, acceptable, even noble desires that are good for us. And what are some of these desires? Well, I think Muhammad, the founder of Islam, gives us the best presentation of such desires. Again, on good desires, Muhammad said, to gladden the heart of another human being, to feed the hungry, to help the afflicted, to lighten the sorrow of the sorrowful, to remove the wrongs of the injured. Perhaps the most noble desire is the desire to reduce suffering in the world. I think no series of programs on wisdom and on this subject of desire would be adequate without focusing on what the great thinkers have said about sexual desires. Those of you who have tuned into some of my previous programs know that I did a couple of programs on sex, and again, what some of the great thinkers have said. Well, today I'll be repeating some of that information, but also presenting new information, again, on what the great thinkers claim is a wise attitude towards sex. I've pointed out that there have been conservatives and liberals and centrists in history. among the great thinkers on this subject of sex. Among the conservatives, one would have to list Plato, Epicurus, St. Augustine, Gandhi, and Thomas Merton. And among the liberals on the subject of sex, Sigmund Freud, of course, Montaigne, Carl Jung, Bertrand Russell, and the famous German philosopher Nietzsche. And, of course, the most famous centrist on this subject of sexual desire and what might be the wise person's attitude towards it would be Aristotle. Thoreau, I think, provides some interesting introductory comments about sexual desire. And here are Thoreau's own words. The subject of sex is a most remarkable one, since though it occupies the thoughts of all so much, and our lives and characters are so affected by its consequences, yet mankind agrees to be silent about it. Thoreau goes on to say this: I believe it is unusual for the most intimate of friends to impart the pleasures and anxieties connected with this fact. So on the one hand, Thoreau points out that sex occupies the thoughts of all so much, and that these thoughts affect our characters. But then he goes on to say that he believes that it's rare that even the most intimate friends talk about both their anxieties and their pleasures connected with sex. And again, Thoreau is reminding us that sex is a source of both anxiety and pleasure. Let's talk for a moment about the power of sex. And here the Bible provides much useful information. The Holy Bible says that sex wields the power to drive people crazy. Sex wields the power to drive people mad. Dostoevsky, the famous Russian writer, in his very famous novel entitled The Brothers Karamazov, has one of his characters say this: a man will fall in love with a woman's body, even with a part of a woman's body, and he'll abandon his wife and abandon his children and sell his parents and even his country too in order to be with her. Thomas Mann, in a very famous book entitled The Magic Mountain, talks about lust being a form of torture. And in The Magic Mountain, someone is talking to Hans Castorp, the leading character of this novel, about sexual desire and how it can be a torture. And here's what the character says: there are many kinds of torture, Castorp, and whichever one you are under, your one desire is to be free of it. But the torture of fleshy lust, but the torture of fleshy lust is the only one you can never wish to be free of, except through satisfaction. Well, what might be a wise person's attitude towards sex? I indicated early on the famous thinkers are in some disagreement about this. Later on, I'll talk about some possible common ground between them. But right now, let me point out different viewpoints. First, the conservative viewpoint among the great thinkers on the subject of sexual desire. The Platonic Socrates encourages us to cool it on sex. Plato and Socrates believe that lust gets in the way of clear thinking. And the Platonic Socrates says that we do our best thinking when we have the least communion with the body. Socrates says that excessive pleasure sends a man out of his mind. Socrates goes on to say, the body causes confusion and disturbance and dazzles us so that it will not allow us to see the truth. The body causes confusion and disturbance and will not allow us to see the truth. Socrates goes on to say that lovers of wisdom focus on pleasures of the soul, not pleasures of the body. Here are Socrates' own words. One would leave alone bodily pleasures if one were a true lover of wisdom, again, one would leave alone bodily pleasures if one were a true lover of wisdom. It has been said, correctly so, that Christianity, particularly Catholicism, has borrowed much from Plato and Socrates. Plato has one of his characters, an old man named Cephalos, comment that old age is generally the best time of life. Why so? Well, this old man, Cephalos, again a Platonic character, says it's the best time of life, or it can be the best time of life, because at that time one is freed from the frantic slave drivers. Those are his words. In old age, one is freed from the frantic slave drivers. And what does he mean by frantic slave drivers? He means lust in one way or another. I wonder what Socrates and Plato would think of Viagra. Another ancient Greek philosopher, Epicurus, agreed with Socrates and Plato, and he said this, and I'm quoting Epicurus. This is a rather famous quotation on sex. Sexual intercourse has never done a man good, and he is lucky if it has not harmed him. Epicurus believed that intellectual pleasures are to be preferred to sexual pleasures. Why so? Well, Epicurus, like Plato, like Socrates, believed that intellectual pleasures can bring us tranquility, can result in making us more tranquil. Whereas, on the other hand, sexual pleasures are more likely to cause us disquietude. That sexual pleasures satisfy us for only a short while. The idea is that sexual desires lead to a vicious cycle. We itch to scratch and scratch to itch. So many of the famous thinkers have said the more sex we have, the more we want. That sex has the quality of an addictive drug, and that too much sex can make us less productive in other spheres of living. How so? How can too much sex make us less productive in other areas of our lives? Well, I think a good historical example of this is the famous professor who lived during the Middle Ages, Pierre Abelard, who was teaching at a very prestigious university in the 12th century. And he became a tutor to a teenage girl at the request of the girl's uncle. And he fell in love with this teenage girl and began having sex with her. And eventually, when the girl's uncle found out that this very famous professor was having sex with his teenage daughter, the uncle proceeded to arrange for some of his friends to sneak into Abelard's quarters and castrate him. This, by the way, is a very famous story. Abelard eventually went to a monastery and his teenage girlfriend to a nunnery. Well, what does this have to do with the theme of today's program? Well, it has to do with it in this sense, that Abelard's students had noticed right around the time that Abelard was having this affair with the teenage girl, that his lectures had lost some of their luster, that at one time he had been a very exciting, interesting lecturer. But when he was having this affair with the girl, his lectures were pretty much boring. And the idea is that perhaps he was expending so much of his energy on sex that, again, another area of his life, the working area of his life, had suffered as a result. Another example of a famous thinker who urges us to cool it on sex was Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi was married at the age of 13. He tells us this in his autobiography, and also tells us that almost immediately after being married, he began having sex with his wife, who was also 13. The marriage was an arranged marriage, which in the late 1800s, when Gandhi was married, was the custom in India. Gandhi points out that in his mid-30s, after approximately 20 years of much sex, he took the vow of celibacy and decided that for the rest of his life, he was not going to engage in sexual intercourse. He wrote his autobiography in his 50s, after he had refrained from sex for about 20 years. And in his autobiography, he talks about the consequences of celibacy for him. And he says this: "The freedom and joy that came to me after taking the vow to abstain from sex had never been experienced before." So Gandhi tells us that he experienced far more joy, far more tranquility in the years in which he was not having sex than in the years when he did have sex. Although he points out that celibacy was not easy, he says this: "It took me a long time to get free from the shackles of lust, and I had to pass through many ordeals before I could overcome it." He does point out that celibacy is not easy. Celibacy was not easy for him. Indeed, in his 50s, in his autobiography, he says that celibacy is like walking on the sword's edge. And he points out that he still has impure thoughts. But he says that even though celibacy is not easy for him, that nevertheless, he is enjoying more tranquility and has more energy and is living a much more satisfying life than when he was having sex. St. Augustine, by the way, in his very famous autobiography entitled The Confessions, says something very similar to Gandhi. St. Augustine says that in his youth, he says, and I'm quoting him, "I was the slave of lust." He says, beginning at age 16, and I'm quoting him now, "The frenzy of lust imposed its rule on me." And he says he prayed to God as a young man. And here is his prayer, his own words: "God, grant me chastity and self-control, but please, not yet." Augustine claimed that lust impeded his attempts to think clearly. He said lust weakened his efforts at introspection and contemplation. He later fathered an illegitimate child. Some years later, Augustine decided to become a priest. Indeed, eventually he became a very famous bishop. And of course, he became celibate. And in his autobiography, Augustine tells us he experienced far more tranquility and joy in being celibate than when having sex. He claimed that being celibate didn't solve all of life's problems, that indeed life was still difficult. And in fact, in his autobiography, he says that after becoming celibate, he still had sexual fantasies in his sleep. But he says, nevertheless, that his life was better. His life was more satisfying. Augustine, by the way, being the good Christian that he was, claimed that this life is a trial, so that even when we are getting satisfaction out of life, life will still be difficult. So again, celibacy was not easy for him, but he found it to be better. What I'd like to do now is to provide another viewpoint. I've talked about some thinkers who are conservative thinkers on the subject of sex. I mentioned Plato, Socrates, Epicurus, Gandhi, and Augustine. Let me now talk about the most famous liberal on the subject of sex, and that, of course, is Sigmund Freud. Freud believed that too much sexual repression can lead to neurosis, can lead to mental disorders. Nervousness, compulsive behavior, for example. Freud, after treating many patients for mental illness, came to this conclusion. He said, and I'm quoting him, he said that so many of the problems they were experienced were the results of conflicts between their sexual impulses and their resistances to sexuality. So Freud came to the conclusion that sexual repression can lead to all kinds of psychological problems. On the subject of neurotic symptoms, Freud said this, and I'm quoting him: "Neurotic symptoms are, in essence, substitutive satisfactions for unfulfilled sexual wishes." And in a very famous essay on sexual morality, Freud said this. He said, "Society requires too much sexual restraint from people." He said, and he's writing, by the way, he was writing in 1908, Freud said this: He said society expects people to have no sex until marriage, and then expects them to have no sex with anyone except their spouse. Freud went on to say that most human beings find such exactions impossible to obey, or obey them at exorbitant emotional cost. Freud claimed he saw much nervousness among people in society, and he believed that so much of the nervousness he saw in people was caused by excessive self-denial of sex. In 1915, in a very famous essay, Freud urged that society promote the idea that people should have a much freer sexual life. Freud claimed that most physicians, most experts, vastly underestimated the power of the sexual drive. Another very famous liberal on the subject of sex was the very famous 20th century philosopher Bertrand Russell. Russell was so liberal on the subject of sex that in the 1940s he was not allowed to teach at the City University of New York because it was claimed his thoughts about sex were too liberal. And what were those thoughts? Well, in the 1940s, Russell expressed the idea that premarital sex was not immoral, and that indeed premarital sex could be good for people. Russell also in the 1940s expressed the idea that homosexuality should not be against the law. You probably know in the 1940s homosexuality was against the law in many countries of the world. Russell went on to say that if people have a good sex life, they're likely to treat other people better. He also said if people have a good sex life, they're less likely to be envious of other people. Indeed, Russell said sexual envy is even more common than professional envy. I see I'm running short on time now, so next week I'll continue with this discussion of what the great thinkers have said about what might be the wise person's attitude towards sex. But right now, let me close, as I usually do, with a quote from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau said the following: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."